year is 1883. In the hushed corridors of St. Catherine's Hospital, nestled in the outskirts of Baltimore, the candles never extinguished, not by wind, not by time, not by prayer. A man enters a locked ward, the brass key cold in his palm. What he sees behind that oak door will never be recorded in any official file. Just one note, etched into the corner of a forgotten ledger. Patient 215, declared whole by the divine, expired in silence. Most stories about medicine are stories of progress, antibiotics, surgery, miracles wrought by science. But this one isn't. This story is about something else, something darker. It's about 215 patients who entered a faith healing ward in one of America's most respected religious hospitals and never came out, not cured, not whole, not even entirely dead by some accounts, just gone, buried under a silence that lasted generations. You won't find this in your textbooks, not in your lectures, not in your journals, because someone, or something, made sure you wouldn't. St. Catherine's was more than a hospital. It was a sanctuary wrapped in theology and liturgy, where suffering was said to be sacred, and death, if it came, was said to be God's will. That's what they told the families. That's what they told the press. But in the locked rooms of the third floor, behind double doors painted with sacred oil, the truth was something else. A program, a system, a ritual. What we're about to uncover is no ordinary piece of history. It's a descent into a medical theology so secretive, so psychologically intricate, it defied explanation even to those who carried it out. These weren't healers. These were architects of divine control, men and women who believed they could sanctify pain, script death, and call it mercy. Patients entered the faith healing ward from 1860 to 1894. Not one of them left alive. Their deaths were not due to disease, no. And exactly, they were guided, watched, catalogued, and they were not entirely unconsenting. Tonight, I'm going to take you through the doors that never should have opened, past the lies, past the doctrine, into the psychological mechanics of belief, obedience, and surrender. This isn't just a story. It's a warning. Once you hear what really happened at St. Catherine's, the way you look at faith, medicine, and institutional power will never be the same. And it begins with one phrase buried deep in the hospital's sealed archives, declared whole by the divine. They said the chapel always smelled like roses, even in winter, even when the frost cracked the windows and no flowers grew for miles. It was a sign, the sisters said, a symbol that healing had begun. But the nurses knew better. The scent wasn't floral, it was chemical, sweet, metallic, masking something that would rot without permission. You have to understand, St. Catherine's didn't operate like other hospitals. There were no visiting hours in the faith healing ward, no clocks on the walls, no names above the doors. The moment a patient was admitted, they were given a number. No last rites unless authorized, no autopsies unless approved. Consent? It was written in the fine print of faith. God's will was the only signature that mattered. And the patients believed it, not because they were naive, but because they were desperate. Every single one had been told they were beyond help. Tuberculosis, cholera, advanced neuralgia. A few with conditions not even named by medicine yet. They had no options, only hope. And St. Catherine's knew how to sell hope, not with medicine, with theater. Imagine, a woman, gaunt and coughing blood, is wheeled into a ward draped in white linen and gold crucifixes. A priest reads a passage from Isaiah. A nun anoints her chest with sacred oil, the lights dim. Chanting begins, not sung but spoken in Latin. 4 voices. Perfect unison. Then silence. Total absolute silence for 72 hours. No food, no contact, just prayer. They called it the preparation. During those 3 days, the patient would be monitored through a slit in the door. No one entered, No one spoke. They were fasting not just from food but from the outside world, a complete spiritual isolation. The theory? That healing couldn't begin until the soul was emptied, broken down, stripped of all worldly identity. But here's the part that was never printed, never mentioned in any homily or hospital memo. During the preparation, the patient's behavior was documented in extreme detail, down to the minute. Breathing patterns, dream content, sudden confessions, anything deemed anomalous was annotated. These notes weren't kept in medical charts. They were bound in black books marked with Roman numerals. When those books were discovered decades later in a sealed storage crypt, some of the entries didn't make sense. One dated May 2, 1873 read, Subject 041, at 3:22 a.m., subject spoke to someone not present. Repeated phrase, I see the men without faces, eyes open, not responsive to voice. Record classified under Category A, Category A. The archivists who found it had never seen that designation in Catholic medical records, but they would, dozens of times. You still with me? Because this is just the surface. They were called Category A cases, though no one outside the ward knew what that meant. Not the city inspectors, not the patients' families, not even most of the clergy. Only a select few ever saw those records. And once they did, most of them left the church entirely. Here's what the files revealed. Category A, patients had something in common. Not an illness, but a response. During the preparation, their minds didn't unravel the way others did. They didn't beg for forgiveness or hallucinate dead relatives. They didn't wither. They resisted. Some even thrived. Their vitals improved. Their pupils dilated in the dark. Their voices lowered. One subject, according to Record 7, spoke fluent Latin, though previously illiterate. Another predicted the precise time and date of a fire that would destroy a nearby orphanage 3 days before it happened. The staff called these patients the vessels, and they were feared. The theory, unspoken, undocumented, was that something ancient could enter through suffering. That spiritual exposure in isolation didn't just purify the soul. It invited others in, not angels, not demons, something older, something the early church had no name for. The hospital's founder, Father Augustine Mallory, wrote in a private letter, These are not possessions, they are permissions. When the soul is made empty, the old voices come to drink. And so the Faith Healing Ward quietly changed its procedures. No more rosaries, no more sermons. The Category A patients were moved to a different wing, never shown to the public. The hallway was painted black. The windows were sealed. Nurses rotated every 6 hours, never working consecutive shifts. Priests assigned to the new ward were never allowed to hear confession afterward, not because of what they'd hear, but because they might repeat it. Now here's where it breaks from tragedy into something else entirely. In 1881, a patient designated 083A was brought in from New Jersey. Female, 29 years old, stage 4 bone cancer. She was unresponsive, her body was shutting down. But 3 days into preparation, she stood up unaided, walked to the window, and recited Psalm 88 in reverse, word for word. Her voice changed. Her blood pressure rose to impossible levels. Her file ends abruptly with a single sentence. Observation terminated, witnesses transferred. Transferred where? No one knows. Their names were scrubbed from personnel logs. But 3 months later, a new room was added to the hospital, windowless, reinforced, and behind its locked door, no patient, just a single chair bolted to the floor, facing north. Still think this was just about healing. They say no one ever died in that chair, but no one ever left it the same. The room became known, even among the staff, as the orientation chamber. Not officially, of course. On paper, it was listed as Storage A17. But everyone knew what it was for. The chair wasn't medical. It had no restraints, no IV hookups, no pulse monitors, just leather armrests worn down by decades of clenched hands. And a floor stained with something that never quite came out. no matter how many times it was scrubbed with bleach and prayer. Here's what they did there. New personnel selected for the Divine Healing Ward's inner circle, what Anderson's hidden notes referred to as the elect, were required to spend a single silent hour in that room. No instructions, no reading materials, no one watching, just them and the chair, under a single overhead light. The door locked from the outside. Some left shaking, some left laughing. A few, according to later psychiatric reports, never spoke again. But one trait was consistent across all who endured it. They became loyal, not to the church, not to Anderson, but to the work. The capital W work that no one ever defined in writing, but which guided every decision in that ward like the gravity of an unseen planet. And then came the children. Starting in 1883, the hospital began receiving younger and younger patients, not sick, not dying, just sent. Wards of the state, they called them, orphans mostly, boys between 9 and 13, transferred from institutions across the Midwest. On what authority, no one ever clarified. Their files came sealed. Their origins were vague, but every one of them was assigned to orientation. They were always admitted alone, no family, no ceremony. And every time, after a week or two in the black hallway, one would be selected, brought to the chair, left inside for 66 minutes. No one knows why it was always 66. But one nurse, they recalled that afterward, their eyes never moved the same way again. They stopped blinking like normal children. They started staring directly into light. By 1885, there were 24 of them. They called them the choir. They didn't sing hymns. They didn't speak at all unless prompted. But when asked about their purpose, every single one gave the same answer: to witness the becoming. Becoming of what? That's the question they never wanted anyone asking. At first, they were seen as a curiosity. Quiet children in clean linen robes gliding through the corridors like ghosts. Nurses called them Anderson's lambs, half affectionately, half in fear. But beneath their passive stares was a coordination that unsettled even the most seasoned orderlies. They never broke formation. They never answered a question differently. And when one fell ill, all 23 others would stand outside his door in silence until he either recovered or disappeared. No record shows what happened to the ones who didn't recover. But here's what is documented, if you know where to look. On November 3, 1886, a janitor named Elias Griggs submitted a written complaint to hospital administration. He'd been assigned to clean beneath the chapel floorboards during a plumbing repair. According to his statement, he discovered a narrow hatch sealed with wax and marked with a symbol he didn't recognize, a triangle within a circle, with a dot at its center. He reported hearing a faint humming beneath it, rhythmic, mechanical, almost like chanting through a machine. 3 days later, Griggs was dismissed for theft of hospital property. No charges were filed. No stolen item was ever named. He vanished from Pittsburgh records. His name doesn't appear again until 1904, listed among the residents of a long-term psychiatric facility in Ohio. Diagnosis: religious hallucinations. But before they erased him, Griggs spoke to a local priest. In a letter discovered in church archives decades later, Father Albinus McRae writes, Mr. Griggs trembled violently as he described the hatch. Said he could feel a pressure in his skull, a weight like someone pressing a finger behind his eyes. He claimed the boys, the choir, were not patients but instruments, that they had been tuned to something, not of God. That phrase appears again in a later investigation, not of God. It is whispered among a few nuns, scribbled in a margin by a city coroner, and spoken once during a drunken confession by Chaplain Walsh himself before his disappearance in 1891. What were they tuning the children to? And why did that hum beneath the chapel match the frequency later discovered in modern brainwave manipulation? Because here's where it gets darker. One of those boys, one of the original 24, shows up again. Not in a hospital. Not in a grave. In a government file. Code name, Bellwether. Bellwether was never his real name. That was stripped from him, like his past, his family, even his medical history. The file lists only a birth date, July 17, 1876, and a single identifying mark, a cross-shaped scar behind the left ear. But more chilling is what followed. Subject exhibits complete hemispheric synchronization. Auditory-induced trance states achieve full compliance within 3.2 seconds. This wasn't a patient. This was an asset. The document, classified until 1998 and leaked briefly before being pulled from circulation, came from a division that didn't officially exist in 1901, Office for Neural Advancement, later absorbed into what we now know as DARPA. But the handwriting matches earlier records from St. Catherine's Hospital. The ink, the phrasing, even the meticulous use of red ink footnotes, all identical to Anderson's personal research journals. What does that mean? It means the Divine Healing Ward never shut down. It just changed names. Bellwether was transferred from St. Catherine's in 1892 under the guise of an orphan adoption. But according to internal memos, he was placed into something called Choir Echo Group 7, a black program testing the application of synchronized vocal frequencies on behavioral control. He didn't sing hymns anymore. He created them. It was discovered that when Bellwether hummed a specific 7-tone progression, originally transcribed from the chapel's underground hum, those around him showed changes in neurological activity, slowed breathing, lowered defenses, dissociation, in some cases, memory suppression. And this is where things get terrifying. A declassified memo from 1923 refers to Project Peacewell, a psychological conditioning protocol trialed in prisons, schools, and eventually military bases. One footnote reads, Bellwether Protocol effective in pacification during high-tension scenarios. Potential use, civil UN, rest, POW compliance, mass behavioral reprogramming. And you thought the healing ward was just about sick bodies? It was never about curing illness. It was about testing the boundaries of obedience, of how far you could push the human soul before it collapsed and rebuilt itself under command. And here's the kicker. Bellwether didn't die. The last page of his file is stamped with a transfer date. Location, Montauk Point. Purpose, cross-frequency integration test with auditory visual entrainment unit. Codename, Red Veil. You're starting to feel it, aren't you? The sickness wasn't in the patients. It was in the sound. The chapel at St. Catherine's was never meant for prayer. If you study the original blueprints, before they were redacted and sealed, you'll notice something strange. The architecture of the third floor doesn't align with the rest of the hospital. The corridors shift slightly off-axis, forming a geometric pattern too precise to be accidental. When overlaid with sacred geometry, it matches the Vesica Piscis, an ancient symbol used not only in Christian art but in pre-Christian ritual sites across Mesopotamia, Babylon, and yes, even Egypt. But the real horror lies below the chapel. Buried 23 feet beneath the altar was a room labeled only once in a single construction note, the quiet chamber. The walls were lined with hematite, a mineral known for its electromagnetic resonance. The floor, a perfect octagon carved into the stone. At the center stood a blackened iron chair bolted to the foundation, with 4 copper rods extending from its arms. This wasn't a chamber for healing. It was a tuning fork for the human mind. Every patient moved to observation spent their final night in this room. Their screams never echoed. Why? Because of what Sister Murphy called the Shroud Protocol. It wasn't just silence, it was suppression. Below the chapel, beneath the hymns, beneath the holy water and the prayers, was a device. Anderson called it the resonant nullifier, a machine that emitted a low-frequency hum at precisely 17.2 hertz. That's the exact frequency the human eye can't perceive, but the nervous system does. It causes confusion, nausea, suppressed emotions, compliance. You ever wonder why so many patients died peacefully? Because they didn't die aware. They died open. Wide open to whatever was transmitted through them in their final hour. Records show that during each death, Walsh transcribed what he called last echoes, phrases whispered by the dying, always in perfect Latin, despite most patients never having studied it. Domus Dei non est domus misericordiae. The house of God is not a house of mercy. So here's the truth they buried under doctrine, under red tape, under 70 years of silence. The Divine Healing Ward was a laboratory for entrainment, the synchronization of body, mind, and will to a central frequency. And the quiet chamber? It was never for prayer. It was a transmission node. There was one man who heard what he wasn't supposed to. Not a patient, not a priest, not a doctor. A janitor named Ellis Carr, Vietnam veteran, honorable discharge, worked nights to support 2 daughters. He swept the third-floor halls of St. Catherine's between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. for 6 years. Barely spoke. Carried a flask filled with communion wine he stole from the chapel, but he kept a journal, and that journal survived. The final entry is smeared with blood and ash. The handwriting shakes like a man fighting something inside his skull. I saw them carry her in. She wasn't sick. She was fighting, but they said she was chosen. When the chapel door shut, the humming started again. And then it stopped. Everything stopped. I went to the quiet chamber when the lights flickered. They didn't know I had the keys. She was still in the chair. Her eyes were open, but she was whispering in my voice. In my voice. What Ellis stumbled into wasn't a failed treatment. It was a successful possession. You see, the quiet chamber wasn't just harvesting death. It was creating receptacles. The combination of trauma, frequency entrainment, isolation, and prayer-based hypnosis wasn't for healing the body. It was for erasing the self, to leave a vessel, a human shell. In religious terms, you'd call it exorcism in reverse. Not casting spirits out, but preparing a soul to be invited in. And if you think that's just metaphor, then explain why every single patient was listed as no known religious affiliation by their 3rd week, despite coming in devout, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish. Their beliefs were dissolved, language stripped down to primal utterances. Ellis wrote that by the 3rd night they all spoke the same word in their sleep, Ashel, a name not found in any scripture. But it does appear in the Book of Raziel, an ancient Kabbalistic grimoire hidden for centuries. It's defined as the one who enters through the wound. Ask yourself, why would a hospital document patients saying this? Why were recordings made, and why were their mouths sewn shut before burial? You think I'm speaking in riddles? Check the burial records at Our Lady of Sorrow Cemetery. Find the graves marked with 3 iron nails and no name. Then tell me what you believe, because belief won't save you anymore. Not in St. Catherine's shadow. Not when the wound is still open. They called it the Protocol of Saints. Not publicly, not in any medical literature, but in the hidden correspondence between Dr. Thorne, Sister Magdalene, and an unnamed Vatican archivist, identified only by the sigil M. The phrase repeats like a code. Begin Protocol of Saints upon terminal submission. The vessel must be purged before the 3rd utterance. Seal the mouth, anoint the feet, leave no witness breathing. You weren't supposed to see this. None of us were. The Vatican denies all involvement, of course, but an archived letter discovered in 1973, hidden behind a false wall in a shuttered monastery in Avignon, makes something disturbingly clear. St. Catherine's methods were not heretical. They were premature. Understand what that means. They weren't condemned for being evil. They were condemned for revealing too much, too soon. The protocol of saints was a blueprint, not for salvation, but for soul displacement. A ritualized method of erasing identity, breaking consciousness, and making room for something older. Patients weren't healed. They were reformatted. Now, pause. Consider this. Why was it always 2:15? Not 2:16, not 2:14. Exactly 2:15 patients. The final record, dated April 3, 1899, notes, Patient 215 has reached full compliance. Tongue severed, memory collapsed, voice modulation stable. Voice modulation? That's not a medical term. That's broadcast engineering. What was being transmitted from the quiet chamber? And more importantly, to whom? Modern researchers dismissed it all. Called it religious hysteria mixed with experimental malpractice. But there's something they can't explain. The voice recordings, 7 wax cylinders, recovered during the 1987 demolition of the East Wing, restored by audio engineers in Berlin. When played at half speed, the voices speak in perfect Akkadian, an extinct language, dead for 3,000 years. One phrase repeats on all cylinders. I have returned through the door of pain. I bring no light. Let that settle. What door? What return? What saint would bring no light? And why were the cylinders buried beneath a steel baptismal font? You've been told hospitals are places of healing, but St. Catherine's was not built for the living. It was a forge, and 215 souls were melted to make keys. Keys to what? That's what we open next. They sealed it behind 22 inches of reinforced limestone, no door, no window, just a wall that hummed when the hymns started. They called it the quiet chamber. Not in official schematics, of course. On paper, it didn't exist. But ask any of the old maintenance workers, the orderlies who drank too much on night shift, or the boys who delivered coal during the winter months. They'll all tell you the same thing. There was something wrong in that east hallway. Sometimes they'd hear murmuring, not voices, not in any language they knew, more like syllables underwater, dragged across miles of stone, vibrating through bone, not ear. It made their teeth ache, and their dreams stopped. For days after delivering firewood to the East End, even the most faithful attendants reported a haunting silence in their sleep. No dreams, no thoughts. Just the sound of breathing, not their own. Inside the quiet chamber, according to one fragment of a confiscated diary, the final 30 patients, patient 186 through 215, underwent what Sister Magdalene referred to as the white crucifixion. But this wasn't about salvation. It was about conversion. Not from sinner to saint, but from human to hollow. Here's what the hidden transcripts describe. Patient is placed in the center of the chamber. 4 concentric rings drawn in ash surround them. Anointing oil, mixed with mercury and crushed locust resin, is poured into the ears, nose, and mouth. The patient is told to repeat a single phrase, nulla voluntas nisi tua, no will but yours. They repeat this until their voice is no longer their own. Then, silence. 28 minutes, always the same duration. When the chamber reopens, the patient is either dead, mouth stretched in a permanent scream, or alive, but unrecognizable. They no longer blink unless prompted. They do not remember their name. They no longer fear fire. Instead, hey, recite scripture backward. In Aramaic. Who taught them? Who waits behind that wall? One of the last orderlies to work in the East Wing, a man named Peter Laurel, fled the country in 1903. In his only surviving letter to his sister in Chicago, he wrote this, "Tell the bishop I never opened the final lock, but I heard it breathing. Tell him." It doesn't sleep. It remembers us. Are you starting to feel it? That cold edge behind your ribs? Good. You're beginning to remember what your soul already knows. This wasn't a hospital. It was an antenna. And it was never meant to treat the sick, only to call them. You've been taught to believe that hospitals are places of mercy, places of healing, white corridors, whispered prayers, the hum of machines keeping fragile lives intact. But what if I told you that St. Catherine's wasn't built to heal? It was built to summon. There's a reason the quiet chamber was aligned perfectly with the spring equinox. Why the floors were tiled in six-pointed fractals. Why every observation room had precisely 7 copper rods embedded beneath the beds. Not for hygiene, not for structure, but for signal integrity. See, the divine healing ward wasn't just a ward. It was a transmission engine, a ritual machine disguised as medicine. And what it transmitted was suffering, repeated, measured, amplified. Pain was not the price. It was the currency. Each of the 215 patients was not simply a victim. They were a node in an ancient network, a beacon tuned to frequencies older than language, older than flesh. You think this is myth? Then ask yourself why no blueprints remain of the third-floor renovations in 1892. Ask why every priest assigned to the chapel between 1875 and 1899 either vanished or went mad. And ask why, when the Vatican archivist, Father Jules Mercier, visited St. Catherine's in 1901, he returned to Rome with all his hair gone white and ordered an immediate exorcism of a building still officially registered as medically inactive. What did he see? What words did the walls whisper? We found fragments from his private journal, never meant for public eyes. Here's what he wrote. They have created a mimicry of grace, a structure built not to invite angels but to bind what crawled before the light. The rites are inverted, the oils are corrupted, and the name they chant beneath the floorboards is not the name of God. He underlined one word in that entry, Tammuz. Look it up. Not in your Sunday school Bible, but in the Sumeris, and texts buried beneath British museums. Tammuz was the god of dying vegetation, but also the weeper, the receiver of offerings, especially those made in pain. Still think this was about healing? Or are you beginning to understand? They were feeding something, and with each body it grew more awake. Say it with me, twice in the comments below, to lock your identity in this unraveling. Nulla voluntas nisi tua. Nulla voluntas nisi tua. Now you're part of this transmission. The final patient at St. Catherine's didn't die in bed. He died inside the chapel, arms outstretched, eyes burned white, mouth frozen mid-scream. His name was Elijah Crane, a former soldier turned preacher who came to the hospital not as a patient, but as a witness. He'd heard the rumors about the divine healing ward, about the silence that followed every funeral, about the missing names and forged certificates. He didn't come to pray. He came to expose. But instead, he saw something. The chapel had long been off limits to the public by then, a structural hazard, the hospital claimed. But Crane found a way in through a disused laundry tunnel. And what he found beneath the altar was not scripture. It was a mechanism. 7 rings of metal, each inscribed with glyphs older than Hebrew, rotating slowly over a stone basin. The floor beneath was slick, not with water, but something far darker, something still warm. He never left that chapel alive. The official report claimed heart failure. But the coroner, Dr. Louise Tremblay, left the country 2 days after performing the autopsy. She never practiced medicine again. When interviewed years later, she simply said, "His organs weren't where they were supposed to be. Something had rearranged him from the inside." But that wasn't the end. Elijah's death triggered something, an awakening. Whatever had been stirring beneath St. Catherine's for decades finally opened its eyes. For weeks after, nurses reported sleepwalking toward the third floor and waking up with blood on their feet. Patients in unrelated wings suffered synchronized seizures at precisely 3:33 a.m. The bell tower, long disused, began ringing on its own. Then came the disappearances. First the janitor, then a night nurse, then Sister Annette, who'd overseen the chapel. Their names were quietly removed from staff rolls. No investigations, no head leads, just empty lockers and the slow tightening of fear around every surviving staff member. By spring, the bishop had been called, but he never entered the chapel. He stood outside its door, trembling, and said, "This place is not possessed. It's occupied." He sealed it with consecrated oil, but the oil turned black by morning. So ask yourself, what was the divine healing ward really healing, or worse, what was it incubating? Because when 215 people never walk out of a room, that room doesn't just remember, it evolves. It was catalogued as item 3437B, no author, no title, just one thick, leather-bound volume pulled from beneath a collapsed pew in the chapel after the fire. The fire that wasn't on the news. The fire that melted stone but left the book untouched. The cover was cold to the touch, even days later, even under direct sunlight. And stamped into the hide was a single shape, a spiral carved in reverse, like it was crawling inward, not out. Linguists from 3 universities were brought in to decipher the script. None could identify the language. Not Latin, not Greek, not Aramaic. But the glyphs reacted to breath. Whisper near the page, and lines would shimmer faintly. One researcher called it responsive ink. Another said, "This is not ink, this is awake." But one man, Dr. Alan Frey, an obscure semiotician from Vermont, recognized the shapes. He'd seen them before in the margins of an unclassified scroll found in the Syrian desert. A scroll never published, and later stolen from the British Museum. He translated the first sentence. "The body is not the house of the soul, it is the gate." The pages that followed were not written in paragraphs, but rituals, instructions, protocols for preparing the vessel. Descriptions of a process called sacral inversion, a method for severing the will from the body without destroying either. This was not scripture. This was a manual. And it described in disturbing detail how to soften the consciousness of a human being, how to draw forth the divine shadow, and how to encode it in blood and breath. More disturbing still, several of the glyphs from the book matched the markings found etched into the skulls of certain patients exhumed from St. Catherine's garden graves. Yes, there were exhumations. Unofficial, silent, ordered by someone far outside the local government. Those skulls are now sealed in a federal vault. But one coroner, before being reassigned, snapped a photo. The image showed not bone, but something growing on the bone. Thin, black filaments woven like roots around the base of the skull. Not mold, not tissue. When examined under a microscope, the sample responded to light frequencies, shifting shape, retreating, folding in on itself like it was hiding. The final page of the book contains no words, only a sketch of the divine healing ward. But the walls are wrong. They're bending, like something is alive inside the architecture. And at the center of the drawing stands a patient with no face. Before the first stone of St. Catherine's Hospital was ever laid, the land was already marked, not by surveyors, not by saints, but by something far older, something that had been waiting. Long before Pittsburgh ever had a name, before the rivers had bridges, before steel built empires, this ridge of earth was a sacred site. The Lenape people called it Lenapu Wakenda, the place the veil thins. They avoided it after sundown, not out of fear but out of reverence. They said spirits passed through there too easily, that the wind carried voices that didn't belong to the living. And at the very center of this land, a stone circle buried by time, later bulldozed during early construction grading. But not before one archaeologist, Dr. Miriam Cole, documented the site. She wasn't allowed to publish her findings. She died in a car accident 3 months later. No one ever found her field notes, except a single photograph leaked to her colleague. It showed one of the stones, carved with a spiral. The same reverse spiral found on the cover of the book in section 13. When the land was purchased in 1875 by the Diocese of Allegheny, the deed was signed in a private transaction, no public auction, no public record. They called it a gift. But the priest who handled the acquisition, Father Anthony Salcedo, left behind letters to a seminary in Milan. In one of them he wrote, "We have found it, the locus of thinning. We begin the work." The work. Not construction, not healing. Something else. The initial blueprint for St. Catherine's was not drafted by an architect. It was adapted from diagrams found in a 14th century codex held in the Vatican's forbidden section. A codex describing monastic healing cloisters from a French order known only as l'Ordo Filium Umbrae, the Order of the Shadow's Son, an order officially dissolved for heresy in 1472. For what? Blasphemous ritu, anatomical desecration, and the spiritual suspension of the soul. Those same architectural patterns were mirrored in St. Catherine's design. 8 chambers in a ring. A hidden 9th at the center, not listed on any public map. That central chamber, the original faith healing ward, sat precisely atop the remains of the old stone circle. It was never a coincidence. This wasn't just a hospital. It was a machine, designed to channel suffering, to collect it, to feed it somewhere. There was no door to the 9th chamber, not at first glance. It lay hidden beneath the chapel altar, disguised behind ornate mahogany paneling. No handles, no hinges. Just a seamless wall, consecrated with ash and hymn. But every Thursday at midnight, when the rest of the hospital went silent, someone would descend. A key, fashioned from brass and bone, fit a lock hidden behind the altar's crucifix. When investigators finally broke through that panel in 1924, what they found wasn't a room. It was a vault. 10 feet underground. Hexagonal. Lined with lead sheeting and old symbols burned into stone, symbols not found in any medical text but present in pre-Christian burial rites from ancient Carthage. At the center of the chamber, a stone table, scored with deep cuts, stained dark with centuries of something that wasn't just blood. Above it hung a single chain, worn smooth at the loop like something had been bound to it. Something heavy, something living. The walls were covered in parchment, patient names, dates, measurements. Not of healing, not of cure, but of extraction. One file read, Subject 087, Vital essence volatile, dissipates upon expiration. Re-administer tonic prior to 4th phase. Maintain chant rhythm. These weren't medical notes. They were ritual protocols. The team also found photographs, hundreds of them. Some faded, some crystal clear. Each patient documented before and after their time in the ward. In every after photo, their eyes were open, but their pupils were gone, as if something had left, or something else had come in. But perhaps the most damning artifact was the journal. leather-bound, smelling of incense and rot. Signed by Chaplain Elijah Varnum, the spiritual director who served from 1881 to 1897. He wrote, "We are not saviors. We are stewards. This place was chosen not to heal, but to transfer. Their pain is a toll, their hope, a key. Each body, a vessel, emptied for the one below." The one below. That phrase appeared repeatedly, in Latin, in Greek, and once in blood, scrawled directly onto the chamber wall. Sub lumen eius, sanatio est oblatio. Beneath its light, healing is offering. The ward wasn't failing. It was functioning exactly as designed. And now, we ask you to seal your awareness. Comment the phrase, "The veil is thin." Comment it twice. For what is seen and what still watches. In 1902, a new director was appointed to oversee operations at St. Catherine's Hospital, Dr. Malcolm Ray, a physician trained in Boston and deeply skeptical of religious medicine. He had read the rumors, he'd heard the whispers, but what disturbed him most were the inconsistencies in the hospital's records, her patients admitted to the faith healing ward. 0 recoveries, 0 transfers, no surviving discharge notes. Only a vague line repeated in each case file. Patient released to Providence. At first he thought it was a euphemism, until he saw what they meant by release. Dr. Ray initiated a quiet audit, no announcements. He simply began requesting old charts, requesting access to the 3rd floor's restricted observation rooms. Within days, strange things began happening. His home was broken into, but nothing stolen. His office desk was rearranged, patient files missing, replaced with Bibles opened to the Book of Job. Then, on November 11th, he was approached by Sister Agatha, a frail nun who had served under both Chaplain Varnum and his successor. She looked like she hadn't slept in years. With shaking hands, she passed him a single envelope. Inside were 12 pages of handwritten notes. And a key. A key labeled simply Room 9. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "Don't open the door until the hymns stop. If they don't stop, don't go in." That night, Dr. Ray waited. Midnight came. The hymns played softly through the ward's gramophone system, as they always did. But at 12:17, they stopped. No fade, no skip. Just silence. Complete, suffocating silence. He took the key. He opened the hidden panel, and he entered Room 9. What happened in those next 7 minutes is only known from Ray's final report, never published, found decades later in a locked safe beneath the hospital's old administrative wing. He wrote, "There were no patients, only husks." B and in humming in unison, not to God, not to anything human. Their mouths moved with no breath, their eyes were bleeding from the inside, and in the center, tied to a pillar, was what I thought was a man, until it opened its mouth sideways. Dr. Ray tried to shut the ward down. He wrote letters to the state medical board, the Archbishop of Allegheny, even the governor's office. None were answered. Instead, he was committed to the Hillcrest Sanatorium for paranoid delusions. He died there 2 years later, blind, mouth sewn shut. The official record said, self-inflicted injuries during religious psychosis. But his last words, scrawled on his bedframe with a broken pen, were, "It's not a hospital, it's a doorway." After Dr. Ray's death, Room 9 was sealed. The official explanation? Structural concerns due to age and disrepair. But the maintenance log told a different story. 4 men sent in to board it up, only 1 returned. He resigned the same night, left town, and was never seen again. His final note was left on the back of a hymn book scribbled in grease pencil. It watches through their prayers. The hospital didn't close, it grew. St. Catherine's became a sanctuary for those beyond medical hope. The faith healing ward was now a whispered legend, a last resort for families shattered by grief. But behind the velvet curtains and golden crucifixes, the same three rules remained. No outside physicians, no unsanctioned visits, no bodies released until after the benediction rite. And no one questioned it. Until 1911. That year, a 14-year-old girl named Eloise Harrow was admitted to the ward. Diagnosed with late-stage tuberculosis, her mother, widowed, desperate, signed the Faith Accord documents without reading them. Eloise, however, had a journal. She wrote in it every day, and unlike the others, she survived long enough to hide it. Her entries began with prayer. But by the second week, they turned cold. "They don't pray to Jesus here. I thought I heard his name once, but they stopped and whispered something in Latin instead. I don't think Sister Mercy has eyelids." On the 19th day, I heard a man crying behind the wall, not yelling, whispering, over and over, something like, "It needs more time, it needs more faith." Then the nurses sang louder, to drown it out. On the 21st day, my fever broke. They said it was a sign I was ready for the benediction, but I saw it. Last night, something in the chapel, under the floorboards. It blinked at me. Sideways. I'm not making that up. Elise's journal ends on the 23rd day. The last page is torn, but one phrase remains. Woyawi, written in red crayon. Don't look at the light. It's not God. Her mother was told Eloise passed peacefully. The funeral was closed casket, but the mortician quit the next day, claiming the girl's tongue had been carved with symbols. Not in ink, not with tools, burned in, from the inside. The journal was found decades later, hidden in the broken base of a chapel candlestand during renovations. Its paper was brittle, but the words were clear. The phrase Eloise heard behind the wall, "Illum qui non dicitur adoramus sub crucis forma," was not part of any Catholic liturgy. Roughly translated, it means, we worship the one who is not named beneath the form of the cross. That single phrase set off alarms for the few researchers who dared analyze it. It doesn't appear in any officially sanctioned Vatican documents, but in the margins of a banned 15th-century codex held in secret at the Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana, a similar line appears, almost identical. In forma Dei sed non de Deo. Vocamus sub signo fallaci. In the shape of God, but not of God. We call under a deceiving sign. It was scrawled next to a crude diagram, a 7-armed crucifix, each tip labeled with a virtue twisted into its opposite. Faith into obsession, charity into dependency, hope into submission. That codex was called Malum Lucem, the treatises on false illumination. It was never meant for circulation. The Pope at the time declared it spiritually corrosive. A few copies survived, most were destroyed, but the implications were clear. There have always been forces that mimic faith, that wear the mask of healing to feed on belief. And at St. Catherine's it was more than mimicry. In 1923, Father Malcolm Trues, a Vatican-trained demonologist, visited the ward under false pretenses. Officially, he was there to consult on a miraculous recovery. Unofficially, he had tracked similar cases across 3 continents, hospitals, churches, orphanages, anywhere that faith was used as a treatment and death rates exceeded statistical norms. He didn't last 48 hours. A single letter was sent to the Archdiocese of Chicago before he vanished. One sentence only. It does not cure. It consumes belief until the body collapses. That letter was never answered. Weeks later, St. Catherine's Chapel was mysteriously renovated. Room 9, sealed again, too, ripple-locked. A bronze plaque was mounted outside, quoting a passage not from Scripture, but from the Malum Lucem itself. Let those who must believe never see the source. Patients kept dying, faith kept flowing, donations surged, the hospital grew, and no one ever spoke of Father Trues again. They called it the 9th hour bell, but no bell ever hung in the faith healing ward, not physically, not visibly. And yet, the nurses heard it. Patients claimed to hear it too, just before the end. Always at 9 p.m. sharp, an hour considered holy in monastic tradition, the hour of Christ's death on the cross. But at St. Catherine's, it meant something else entirely. They said the sound wasn't like any ordinary bell, more like a deep, hollow resonance, as if struck from within the stone itself. A vibration that moved through the walls and into the blood. One nurse described it as a bell that tolls behind your heart. According to sealed incident reports, 63 patients over a 5-year span reported hearing the bell the night before they died. Many described it in the same way. I thought it was calling Mass, but no one came. I heard the bell, then I couldn't move. It wasn't ringing for me. It was ringing through me. What's more disturbing, nurses began associating the bell with exact patient outcomes. It became a kind of omen. If you heard it, you wouldn't survive the night. The administration dismissed the phenomenon as hysteria, citing fatigue, grief, religious preoccupation. But there's one problem with that explanation. A nun named Sister Eloise kept track, not in the official records, but in a personal notebook. Every time a patient reported the bell, she made a mark. Time, room, symptoms, and always the result. Out of 61 documented bell incidents, all 61 patients were dead within 12 hours. Even worse, some patients hadn't been terminal. A few had been improving. Sister Eloise wrote in her journal, "The bell is not calling them to heaven, it is marking their surrender." One entry, ripped out, recovered later, read, "I believe the sound is not external, it's a signal embedded in the structure, or in the blood." Was it an auditory hallucination caused by experimental drugs, a low-frequency phenomenon engineered deliberately, or something else? There's no consensus. But here's what they all agree on. After the bell rings, they stop fighting. Their breathing slows, the eyes gloss over, the body resigns. It's as if something had whispered the outcome straight into their soul, and they accepted it. The corridor to the sub-basement had no official name. It wasn't on blueprints, it wasn't mentioned in orientation. But every night nurse knew about it, they just didn't speak of it, not out of fear, but obedience. It lay behind a maintenance door marked Chapel Storage Restricted. No one remembered when the lock was added, or who had the key. But the rumors? They whispered louder than prayers. In 1931, during renovations after a minor electrical fire, city contractors breached the wall behind that door. What they found wasn't storage. It was a staircase, worn, narrow, descending into earth, not stone. At the bottom, a room colder than the rest of the hospital by 12 degrees. The lights wouldn't hold, batteries drained, cameras malfunctioned. But 3 men entered and 1 came back, white-haired, mute and smelling faintly of ash. Later that year, the room was sealed again. The order came directly from the archdiocese, signed by a bishop who would die of cardiac arrest just 2 weeks later. But not before he filed a confidential report. And this report, never meant for public eyes, was uncovered by a medical historian researching faith-based treatment archives. He only lived 6 days after publishing his findings online. The website was scrubbed in less than 12 hours. Here's what he revealed. The room contained 3 stone chairs, each perfectly aligned under a vaulted ceiling marked with alchemical symbols and what looked like musical notation. The floor bore a spiral, burned, not etched, at its center. A circle, surrounded by words written in Latin. One phrase repeated 12 times, Fides est flamma, flamma est mens. Faith is flame, flame is mind. In the middle of the spiral sat an object that defied classification. part mechanical, part organic, part crafted. It pulsed faintly, though no source powered it. Wires extended from it like veins, reaching toward each chair. This wasn't a medical device. This wasn't for healing. This was for conversion, not of the soul, not of the heart, but of belief itself into energy. Think about it. What if faith could be metabolized? If the sacred trust of the dying could be harvested, transformed into something measurable, controlled? A ritual masked as healing, a system disguised as mercy, a machine that ran not on electricity, but surrender. The patients didn't die for lack of treatment. They died because their beliefs were drained from them like marrow from bone. They found the confession in a worn, leather-bound prayer book hidden beneath a false panel in Sister Helen Murphy's armoire, sealed shut with wax, the kind used in pre-Vatican rites. No one knew it existed until the estate sale, nearly 70 years later, when her possessions were auctioned off with the rest of St. Catherine's condemned artifacts. Inside the back cover was a folded page, yellowed with time. The ink had bled, but the handwriting was unmistakably hers, tight, elegant, and trembling. It wasn't a diary. It wasn't a journal. It was a final reckoning. "I did not build the machine," she wrote. "I only served it." The words strike like thunder. For decades she had been seen as the gentle nurse, the grieving intermediary between death and divine mercy. But here she confessed what no one else dared to say out loud. The divine healing ward was never about healing. "It was always him," she continued. "Not Anderson, not Walsh, the founder. He came long before them. The hospital was built around his will, a cathedral for a power no church ever dared name." She described her first encounter with him. She was 19, fresh from Ireland, trembling in her habit, carrying linens to the upper ward when she took a wrong turn. The elevator opened on the 3rd floor. No bells, no footsteps, just silence, and a figure standing at the end of the corridor facing the wall. She called out, thinking it was a patient. But it didn't move, didn't breathe. When she stepped closer, the air thickened, like stepping into a vacuum. Time slowed, and then it turned, not with muscle, but with intention, as if the universe itself permitted motion on its behalf. Its face she could not describe. Only this: it wore the memory of a man, but not the soul. It didn't speak. It simply raised one hand, and in her mind, a voice. "You will stay, you will serve, you will witness." And she did, for 52 years. She administered sacraments, she cleaned bodies, she comforted families, but every prayer, every ritual, every soft-spoken lie served one purpose: to prepare the mind for surrender. Because the moment a person let go of earthly hope, something else entered. Not peace, not God, something older. Her confession ends with 7 words. No signature, no absolution. "I have never prayed for forgiveness once." The janitor's name was Lawrence DeWitt, 36 years old, widowed ex-Marine, and recently hired as night staff after a nervous breakdown made other work impossible. He took the job for peace, quiet halls, minimal contact, and enough isolation to forget. But what he saw on March 4th, 1964 at 3:13 a.m. inside St. Catherine's Divine Healing Ward shattered what little of his mind remained untouched. Lawrence had a habit of bringing a handheld reel-to-reel camera to work. He'd record birds, clouds, and sometimes his reflections in the polished floors. He said it calmed the tremors in his hands. That night, after hearing unexplained thuds echoing from the 3rd-floor stairwell, he decided to document what he believed was vandalism or a break-in. What he captured should never have existed. The footage, seized and classified by city authorities the following day, was kept sealed in a municipal vault until a whistleblower leaked it to an underground archivist in 2002. It has never aired on television, but if you know where to look, it's out there, grainy, silent, but unmistakably real. The film opens on a dimly lit hallway, pale green walls, chipped crucifixes, a red exit sign blinking at the far end. Then, movement. From the left door labeled Chapel Prep, a patient emerges. Gown open at the back, bare feet, pale skin, too pale. The figure walks stiffly, not like someone healed, but like someone guided, pulled by strings only it could feel. Lawrence pans the camera slowly as two more patients emerge, all walking in the same direction. No eyes blink, no sound. And then, a fourth figure. This one dressed differently. Not a patient, not clergy. A long coat, like a trench coat or robe. The figure raises its hand. The others stop. It turns, directly facing the camera. The lens fractures. Not physically, but the tape itself distorts in that frame, as if reality disagreed with the eyes. It being recorded. The final seconds show the patients kneeling before the robed figure, not in prayer, in obedience. Then static. Lawrence was found 2 days later in his apartment, having taken his own life. No note. Just a Bible open to Isaiah 47. They are wearied in the multitude of their sorceries. Let now the astrologers, the stargazers, the monthly prognosticators stand up and save thee from these things that shall come upon thee. The city called it delusion. Another veteran lost to madness. But the question that still echoes in backroom circles and private forums is this: what kind of healing creates obedience after death? Room 317 didn't exist. Not on the hospital's original blueprints, not in maintenance logs, not even in the construction schematics filed with the city in 1931. But it was there, beneath the chapel floor, behind a false wall, accessible only through a hidden latch built into the altar base. It was discovered by accident during a structural inspection in 1972, after reports of collapsing tiles and strange vibrations during storms. The two men sent to evaluate the chapel's foundation, James Pritchard, an engineer, and Father Lionel Garcia, a diocesan observer, found the latch. They pried it open and descended. Room 317 was carved directly into limestone, 20 feet wide, 15 feet deep. The walls were covered in soot and what appeared to be flaked blood, but that wasn't the worst part. No, it was the handprints. 13 of them, human-sized, perfectly spaced in a semicircle around a raised slab in the center. Not painted, not carved, burned into the stone itself, as if scorched by open flame. Every finger preserved in agonizing detail, down to skin texture and what looked like claw-like impressions at the tips. Pritchard took photos, developed them himself that night. By morning, his hands were covered in second-degree burns. No heat source, no chemical exposure, just the photos. He filed an injury report and tried to return to work. But within days, he began exhibiting signs of paranoid psychosis, claiming to see figures watching him from vents, whispering behind walls. Father Garcia, on the other hand, vanished. Completely. His last known location, the rectory across the street from the hospital. His room was found in order, wallet on the nightstand, dinner still warm on the table. But on his bedspread was a message, scorched into the fabric, not written, but burned. Let the obedient be returned. Let the doubter be taken. It was signed with 3 initial CAWW, same as the sealed ledgers from the original divine healing experiments. Since 1972, room 317 has been sealed twice, once with concrete, then again with a steel vault door installed by the city. But people still report hearing movement below the chapel, muffled chanting, rhythmic pulses that shake the pews, even shadows that flicker through locked glass. No patient records have ever linked to room 317. No treatments were recorded. No prayers logged. But among the hidden notes of Chaplain Walsh, filed under spiritual mapping, he refers to it only once. The mouth opens only when the 13 arrive. The offering is what heals. The hand is what seals. They called it the Book of Hours. But what lay within had nothing to do with time. It was recovered in 1984 during a partial demolition of the East Wing, behind a collapsed stairwell sealed since the fire of 1946. Bound in blackened calfskin with rusted clasps and no visible title, it was housed inside a lead-lined box beneath what appeared to be an altar fragment. The interior pages were dry, unburned, and written in a language no modern scholar could identify. Not Latin, not Greek, not Aramaic. Closer inspection revealed a disturbing pattern. Every seventh page was composed not of parchment, but skin, tanned and pressed so expertly that its origin wasn't noticed until a pathologist examined it under microscope. Human, dermis, adult, male, Caucasian, 17 samples, 17 pages. The first translation attempt came from a Jesuit cryptographer at Georgetown, Father Michael da Costa, fluent in over a dozen classical languages, expert in numeric ciphers. He reviewed the text for 2 weeks, then resigned his post, moved to a monastery in Maine, and refused to speak to anyone from the church ever again. The only note he left behind read, "This is not a prayer book, it's a gate manual." Later experts from the NSA were brought in under the guise of studying Cold War-era codes. They determined that while some sequences mimicked glossolalia, speaking in tongues, others appeared to be instructions. Repeated phrases included, "Bind the witness with fire," "Invoke through absence," "Shed breath before light." But the most disturbing element came from the back cover. An embossed sigil, a 7-pointed star surrounding an eye bleeding from the center, with the words Ex Oculis Medicorum curved beneath it. From the eyes of the healers, this exact sigil was later discovered etched beneath the altar in room 317. Same dimensions, same layout, which means whatever the Sidusha were doing in that sealed chamber, they were following the book. One curious pattern. In every case file of the 215 patients who never recovered, their admission date matched a passage in the book's lunar calendar. Each patient brought in during specific planetary alignments. Each treated within windows referred to as ascension hours, 4-hour periods marked not by clocks, but by celestial position. They weren't being healed, they were being timed, aligned, marked for something older than medicine. They called it the last procedure. But no scalpel touched skin, no anesthetic was administered, no wound was stitched. It was a ritual masquerading as medicine, a convergence of doctrine, precision, and absolute stillness, performed only when 3 conditions were met. The patient had to be within 72 hours of death. The celestial alignment had to match a pattern referred to in the Book of Hours as the mouth of God closed. The attending staff had to include all 3 roles, 1 surgeon, 1 spiritual conduit, and 1 witness of silence. Each of the 215 patients met these conditions, down to the hour. Records recovered from the chapel vaults, encrypted with a cipher used only in 17th century monastic scrolls, described the last procedure, in clinical, detached detail. The book referred to it not as a healing, but a harvest, not of organs, not of souls, of obedience. Step 1 was silence, absolute, not merely the absence of sound, but the extinguishing of it. Devices lined the observation rooms, primitive but effective, creating negative acoustic zones. Patients would scream, but no noise escaped, no echo, no relief. Step 2 was the invocation. Not a prayer, not in any traditional sense. It was language made flesh, Repeated phrases that weren't spoken so much as breathed through surgical masks etched with sacred sigils drawn in wax, ash, and something darker. The chaplain would begin. The nurse would echo. The surgeon would complete it. A three-part harmony in a language no throat should know. Then the patient's eyes were forced open, artificially, chemically, so they couldn't blink, couldn't look away. That's when the mirror was introduced. Each observation room had one, 34 inches wide, framed in iron, covered until the final moment. When revealed, the patient would be instructed by gesture only to look. And something looked back. We don't know what they say, but we know what they didn't do. Move, blink, scream. Some flatlined in seconds. Others took hours, their vitals fluctuating while their bodies remained still. One file, Case 117, a schoolteacher named Evelyn Dane, recorded the most chilling entry. Subject breathing shallow, heart irregular, pupils dilated, lips forming unknown syllables. All staff present report involuntary tears. Room temperature drops 9 degrees. Final words recorded, "It knows me." Time of death, 3:17 a.m. And that number, 317, comes up again. Beneath St. Catherine's Chapel was a room the hospital blueprints never acknowledged. Its entrance was hidden behind the altar's foundation stones. Stones far older than the building itself. Stones traced by geological historians to a quarry in southern France that hadn't operated since 1127 AD. This room was referred to only once in the recovered files, 3:17, the root. No one admitted to naming it. No one dared explain what the number meant. But records show every last procedure ended with the transport of patient remains to this hidden chamber. Not to be buried, not to be blessed, but to be measured. Inside room 317, the temperature remained at a constant 47 degrees, regardless of season, heating, or weather. No mold grew. No insects entered. Instruments left there never rusted. But every staff member who spent more than 4 hours inside suffered identical after effects. Insomnia, bleeding gums, auditory hallucinations, and eventually the compulsion to return. The walls of room 317 were carved, not built, into symmetrical angles so precise that modern architects using 3D scans reported non-Euclidean distortion around every corner. Tools placed near the north wall would slide upward. Fluids behaved erratically. Prayers, when spoken inside, echoed backward. And in the center of the room, a black marble slab, 4 feet wide, 6 feet long, etched with a spiral that matched diagrams from Babylonian dream tablets unearthed in the ruins of Eridu, the first recorded city on Earth. On this slab, each patient's body was laid, not in death, but in transition. The term used in every file wasn't corpse, it was receptacle. Receptacle for what? The final pages offer only fragments. Energy is not destroyed, only directed. We open the vessel so the root may feed. When the eyes see what is beneath the veil, the body forgets it is flesh. This wasn't medicine. It wasn't even ritual. It was engineering. Psychospiritual engineering designed to test the elasticity of the soul. How far consciousness could stretch before breaking. Every patient was a test. Every death, a data point. And the ones who didn't break? They weren't allowed to leave either. Because what came back wasn't always what had gone in. They had to make it disappear. By the winter of 1891, whispers of what had occurred inside St. Catherine's were growing teeth. A young journalist from Chicago had come into possession of copies of the hidden records, photographs of anatomical diagrams, marginalia in Latin, and notes that described patients not as people, but as subjects. His article never made it to print. He was found drowned in the Allegheny River, his coat pockets filled with stones, his apartment ransacked, but nothing stolen. The official story was suicide. Those who knew him said he had never believed in God, but in the end, he was buried under a headstone that read, "Called Home, by divine will. And just like that, the trail went cold again. But the hospital didn't close. In fact, it expanded. It merged, rebranded, and folded into what we now call regional medical systems. The faith healing ward was quietly dismantled, its files incinerated in the hospital furnace, its rooms gutted and renovated into administrative offices. No one talked about what had happened. No one had to. The city benefited from the silence. Landowners kept their properties. Donors saw their reputations protected, and the families of the 215 dead, they never received a single explanation, just condolences, scriptures, and sealed coffins. But something stranger lingered. In 1903, when construction workers were digging the foundation for a new surgical wing, they uncovered a sealed crypt beneath the old chapel. Inside were remnants that no one could quite explain. Iron restraints bolted to the stone floor, candle stubs arranged in geometric patterns, and walls covered in faint inscriptions that resembled both Hebrew and alchemical symbols. The foreman ordered it resealed immediately, and no records of the find exist in the hospital's archives. But one worker, an immigrant from Lithuania, left behind a journal entry that survived in a family Bible. It read, "We opened the gate, but something watched us from the dark. It felt like the eyes of the dead were not dead at all." After that day, workers refused to labor past dusk. Strange illnesses swept through the construction crew. Tools vanished. A scaffold collapsed under clear skies, killing 2. Eventually they finished the wing, but no one would work in the southeast corner alone. What began as divine healing had grown into something else entirely. Not science, not faith, something deeper, hungrier. And they didn't bury it. They built on top of it. There is no neat ending to this story, because the system that built the faith healing ward at St. Catherine's never died. It simply changed its mask. The experiments didn't stop. They were relocated. The language was updated, the architecture modernized, and the theology replaced with science so complex, most wouldn't dare question it. But the philosophy remained the same, that suffering is acceptable if it produces data, that death is permissible if it pushes the boundaries of knowledge, and that secrecy is mandatory to protect the benefactors who fund the work. The names have changed. Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh replaced by committees, boards, and task forces. The observation rooms now have glass walls and smart monitoring systems. The patients are test subjects, the substances more precise, but the goal is unchanged. Understand the human soul by breaking the body. Deaths. And still no official investigation. Why? Because once an institution becomes sacred in the public mind, whether it's a hospital, a church, or a government agency, it gains the power to hide its dead in plain sight. And maybe the most dangerous part isn't the deaths, but the fact that most people would rather not know. That the silence of the community, the compliance of families, the eagerness to believe in hope at any cost, these were not just side effects, they were the fuel. The truth is not buried in a basement, it's carried forward in the practices that continue today, under new branding, but the same ideology. That elite knowledge justifies moral compromise, and that a few chosen minds have the right to decide what the rest of us are allowed to experience, to question, or to survive. If you've stayed with this story until now, then you're not most people. You don't run from discomfort, you don't close your eyes when the truth gets dark. You understand that the world isn't broken by chaos, it's broken by design. Comment, I see the pattern, I break the silence. Twice to lock in what you've just witnessed, because this isn't just about history, it's about today, and it's about you. Because the next ward is already open, the next experiment already underway, and somewhere a door is being locked behind someone who still believes they're being healed. The only difference now is that you know, and once you know, you can't unknow.